Hey guys, AJ here from 3D Printing Systems again. Another maintenance video for you today. We're going to look at replacing parts on your up box to resolve X-axis skipping. Now if you haven't already, check out our skipping diagnosing video. The link will be in the description below. But for this video we're going to be looking at the three parts you need to replace: X connecting rod, you've got the up box belt that drives the X-axis, and we've got the X connecting rod bearing clips. Now you may not need to replace all three of these parts, but we're going to show you how to do all three. Now before we get started on the repair, we're looking at two X connecting rods that have caused issues or caused skipping. Now on both of these rods you can see there's a permanent marker mark to indicate where the cog on this side should line up with the rod. Now on this cog on the left you can see that the line is quite far removed from this line here on the rod. So that shows us that this cog has actually slipped around, which is a cause or likely cause of the X-axis skipping. Now with the rod on the right hand side, you can see that these lines actually line up, but you can also see an exposed adhesive line. So with this one, the cog has actually shifted sideways. Now again, that could lead to wearing of belts, it could lead to increased tension, causing broken X connecting rod bearing clips. But in this case, both these rods have been deemed as faulty or an issue, so they've been replaced. Now the goal here is to replace the X connecting rod that runs parallel at the back of the printer. If you're just replacing the clips or the belt on the right hand side, the process will be slightly different, but ultimately replacing the X connecting rod will take us through what we need to do to replace those other two parts as well. In any case, the procedure starts with removing this clip over here and this clip at the back on the other side so that we can gain access to our connecting rod bearing clip. There's one screw holding the linear rail clip over here in place and the same on the other side. So we're going to start by undoing that. Now to locate the screw, pop your screwdriver up underneath, it'll be a Phillips head type screw, and then start undoing it. Now be sure that you don't lose any screws. It's always handy to keep a container with you during this process. Now I'm just taking off the screw at the front of the printer for the clip. Now once I've removed those two screws, I should be able to lift this up and slide it forward. And that's going to give us access to the next part, which is the connecting rod bearing clip and the belt. Before we can remove this connecting rod bearing clip, we need to release tension on the belt over here and slide it off the motor underneath. In order to do that, we have to loosen these four screws that hold the motor in place. That's going to allow it to tilt and give us access to slide the belt off. Now you need an Allen key to do this. So start by loosening the two closest to the belt. Now just be careful that you don't take them all the way out. They do still need to be attached to the motor in part, and that's going to stop the motor from falling away or coming loose entirely. So I'll start at the front two. Now when we start undoing the back two, then the motor should start to tilt. Now if you see the motor has tilted enough for you to slide the belt off, then you shouldn't need to undo these screws any further. Go ahead and slide that belt off. Right, so I can see my motor starting to tilt just underneath here now. And that should be enough tension released for us to slide that belt off. You can see it's tilting there already. Having a look underneath, use your Allen key to flick the belt off the motor. Should help you give you a bit of leverage. There we go. Now the belt's come loose. Now that we've released the belt from the motor, we can move it out of the way and undo the screws that hold in the connecting rod bearing clip. Now there's two Phillips head type screws underneath. We'll take those out. Now this process is made a lot easier if you have access to a magnetic head screwdriver. That's just going to prevent you from losing any of these screws as you're undoing them. Right, so we've removed the screws of our connecting rod bearing clip. Now just take note, as we pop this out, there are locating pins, even for these grip clips that were removed earlier, there's locating pins to hold them in place. Alright, so that's released our old connecting rod bearing clip. Now if your connecting rod bearing clip in this position was broken, then this would be the point to install your new one and then reverse the process to put everything back together. But we're going to go ahead and remove the belt as well. So popping off the side belt, and then next pulling off the small driving belt, and this one we can twist it inside out and have a look. And it looks like there's a bit of damage to this one, so we're going to go ahead and replace that as well. To replace the X-connecting rod, we're going to have to repeat the same process on the right side, on the left side. So that means removing this rail clip here and the one at the back, and then removing the connecting rod bearing clip. Now on this side obviously we don't have the motor, so we don't have to worry about removing the belt or loosening the motor to get access to the connecting rod bearing clip. Now again, the screws are located underneath. First, the rail clip screws. Loosening the one at the front, again magnetic screwdriver coming in handy. And loosening the one at the back. Now once we've done those two, we should be able to lift up the rail and the connecting rods, the clips, and then slide it towards the back of the printer. And that's going to make room for us to start loosening the connecting rod bearing clip. Now again, there's two Phillips head screws underneath. They'll be the same type as the clips we've just removed, so we can start undoing them. Once you've removed both screws, the bearing clip should come loose. Again, note the positioning holes on the frame and also the bearing where it slots into the clip, just in that groove there. Now connecting rod should come loose, and we'll take it out and replace it with the new one. Now that our connecting rod bearing clip's out of the way, we can move our X-connecting rod, making sure it slides off the belt there. I usually keep the print head to the left hand side. That means that the rod is clear of the white cable as it comes out. Remove the old connecting rod, new connecting rod goes in, slot it into place with the belt on the left hand side. Make sure that the bearing clip in the center lines up with the bearing in the center of the rod. Now it's important that you start putting the left hand side together before we do the right hand side, because that's the way it came apart, and that way we're going to be able to get the belts back on without any trouble. There are a couple of tricks for getting the connecting rod bearing clip in place. First, make sure your bearing is lined up with the locator holes. That's going to make it a lot easier when you put your bearing clip in. Next, make sure that your bearing clip slots in with your bearing. And once we've got that, we can put our rail clip just behind it, and that's going to ease some tension on the belt and make it easier to screw in place. Now we're going to have to find the locating holes underneath. It's got locating pins on the bottom of the clip, and then we're going to screw it back into place. Sometimes it's easier if you hold the clip down with one hand and screw with your other. When you've found those locating holes for the front clip and the bearing clip, you can start to insert your screws from underneath. We've screwed our bearing clip in place. It's nice and tight. Now we're going to put the clips or the screws in our front clips, our rail clips. Now again, these have locating pins, so make sure that they're in place. Now with these screws, you do need to make sure that they are quite tight, and that's going to prevent any movement later on during printing. Now that the left side is all back together, we'll start on the right side. So the first thing is to put our new belt on to replace the damaged one, and we'll slot that over the cog down towards the motor. Next, we'll put our belt back in place on the right hand side, and that will go over the furthest cog. Once we've got those two belts in place, we can put our connecting rod bearing clip over the bearing, find the locating pins, slot that into place, and then we'll slot in our rail clips into their locating pins as well. Once we've got those two in place, we'll put the screws on underneath. Now the clips for our rail clip and our connecting rod bearing clip are nice and tight. We're going to put the belt back on the motor and we're going to slide it into place. Now it can be easy if you rotate the X or slide the X axis back and forward, and that's just going to help the belt slide onto the motor shaft a lot easier. Once you've got that in place, going back to your Allen key and start tightening the motor screws. Again, starting with the ones at the back this time, because those were the last ones that we loosened. Now make sure that these are nice and tight to avoid any slippage later on. Once you have them all tightened, again, moving the X-axis back and forward to make sure that your belt is sitting in the correct position and there's smooth motion in your X-axis. Now that your repair is complete, you'll need to do a test print to ensure the X-axis skipping has been resolved. I recommend doing a column. A square column is always best, and that way you can see if there's any skipping on the front or back faces. Try avoid doing a circular column because it'll be a little bit harder to tell. Until next time.